But I kind of see this as like fork in the road, whatever you want to call it, adapt or die. And for Clemson, this is one of those teams right now that I think they're kind of getting to that point, right? Which way are they going to go? And for more context on this, we're going to bring in the 24/7 Sports Director of Research, straight out of Palo Alto and out of the background yesterday. Ryan McGrady, I see that you are back to a normal circumstance. Good to see that you are safe. A lot of the viewers were worried about you. So, McGrady, what do we have on Clemson?
We got a lot on Clemson. I think Dabo needs his own researcher to go on his radio show with him so that when Tyler from Spartanburg calls in, he could have somebody just rattle off his own stats for him so he doesn't have to sound like he's bigging himself up too much. But Dabo, since 2009 when he became the full-time head coach, he's been at Clemson for 15 seasons, has 10-plus wins in 12 consecutive seasons, 161 wins over that span, the third most in FBS, third highest winning percentage, 8 ACC titles, 6 CFP appearances, second behind Alabama, 2 national titles, tied for second behind Alabama with Georgia, 74 NFL draft picks, 7th most in that span. So if you'd offer that to pretty much anybody, maybe not Tyler from Spartanburg would take it, but I think pretty much every other fan would take that record.
How about Tyler from Spartanburg? Big day for him over this week, getting into it with Dabo Swinney. Bud, I want to start with you here. The stat that we talked about this morning that you brought up to me, that's very important. Since 2009, we all know that college football is a what have you done for me lately type of business. How do you see the future of the Clemson program under Dabo Swinney?
So I still have a lot of confidence that Dabo's going to get this right at Clemson, in large part because they are having the year that they're having. I think this gives some of the power players at Clemson, whether it's the AD or like the big-time boosters, the ability and the leverage to lean on Dabo a little bit and say, hey, man, your record you amassed is awesome, and we are forever grateful for it. But the sport has changed with NIL and with the transfer portal. And this is like a coach who was really good in basketball before they had the 2-point shot, not adapting to when the sport of basketball added in the 3-point shot, right? Clemson's refusal to use the transfer portal, they're essentially kneecapping themselves willingly. There's no real reason. They do a great job in high school recruiting. Watch Clemson games this year. Some of their best players are freshmen. Like, their talent ID is still awesome. Their player dev is still good. But Dabo made a lot of like crony type hires on this offensive staff, right? Dudes who had little to no Power 5 experience, but had played at Clemson, trying to keep it in the family. And they don't use the portal to fix their mistakes. Everybody else is out there identifying. But I think now, like, the AD and the boosters are going to be able to say, hey, Dabo, look, man, we still believe you. We still love you. We're always appreciative. But you do have to start adapting to how the sport's been going the last 3 years. Because the last 3 years, your record ain't what it was from 2009, to basically the COVID year.
So that's my next question. Do you think they have a young AD over there at Clemson, and you talked about the boosters as well. Do you think that there is somebody within the Clemson administration, or at least among the power players, that is capable of getting Dabo's ear in this type of situation and say, look, from 30,000 feet, this is kind of what it looks like. And right now, our ship is kind of taking on water a little bit. Now, we still believe in you, like you said, Bud, and we have a lot of confidence in you going forward. But we need to see some changes. One, who's having that conversation with Dabo Swinney? And two, is he going to hear it?
I think that if they had won 10 games again, probably not, right? But the fact that we are past Halloween now and we're still talking about, will Clemson make a bowl? And look, they're incredibly unlucky this year. If you look at where their success rate is versus their red zone success rate, factors that we know tend to regress toward each other, you're not going to have like a 90-spot gap in those. Clemson has been one of the most unlucky teams in the country. But people aren't trying to hear that, right? They're trying to hear, hey, what's your win-loss record? I do think that the AD and some of your bigger boosters at Clemson are going to be able to tell Dabo, hey, man, you can't hire a staff just of former Clemson players and guys who don't have really any Power 5 experience. And you can't just refuse to use the transfer portal just because you like to instill your culture here, right? There are good players in the transfer portal. It's not 6-7 years ago when, for the most part, when guys transferred, it was because they had problems at their prior school. If Dabo built this thing on culture and talent acquisition, he just needs to expand the pool from which he's acquiring that talent.
What's fascinating about the transfer portal is I actually think it's Clemson's ace in the hole. That's the irony about this whole thing, right? Dabo is so hell-bent on protecting such a unique culture that he has built, and I understand that to a degree, but at the same time, there are a lot of players out there that would fit the Clemson culture, that would love to be part of that locker room, that player development program. We talked about it. Ryan McGrady just came on here and gave the stats in terms of the success, not only on the field, but in terms of player development as well, one of the best programs in the country. Here's my thing, bud. They haven't had a top 5 class over the last 3 years, right? You got to go all the way back to 2021. Right now they're sitting at 16. They were 15 in 2023, 14 in 2022, right? So 2 to 3 years later, that's where you're going to see all those classes materialize. And if you're just banking on your player development program, I think that's where you got an issue. The other thing is they're not as talented on the perimeter. They're not as talented up front. And as much as I like Cade Klubnik, he is not Deshaun Watson or Trevor Lawrence. He's not a generational type of talent, right? So that's where Clemson, I think they got to get back to the basics there. They were one of the best teams in the country when it came to recruiting receiver talent. I think they're right there with Ohio State. Brian Hartline comes to Columbus. They're not even in the conversation anymore. So I think there are a lot of things that they got to get back to, but there's also a new flavor as well. I think defensively, Bud, they're not that far away, right? I mean, they're a top 10 unit in the country. Wes Goodwin, who we talked about, was a guy that a lot of people didn't know a lot about, right? He has done a good job. I think you got to give him some credit. They've recruited well. I think you give them the benefit of the doubt defensively, and I think they got the right guy in terms of the coordinator and young Riley. But at the same time, I think it's more, hey, you got to get the pieces back. And the problem is, and I've seen this with a couple teams, and I think Dabo is a great example of this, the moment you start to believe that your secret sauce is your process and your coaching and your development, you're done. It was never about you. Sure, those are supplementary factors that come into play. It's about the Jimmies and Joes, right? You got to have the guys, and nobody understands that better than guys like Kirby Smart and Nick Saban, which is why they're able to stay atop of the mountaintop. I think Dabo and Clemson have taken on water because we've seen some complacency in the talent acquisition side over the last 3 to 4 years.
Totally agree. I will push back a little bit. I think that statement, like it's about the Jimmys and Joes and not your process. It really applies if you are at a program where the goal and the expectation is national title contention. I think once you get past those like top 18 programs, I really do think like fit, culture, player dev, that matters a whole lot more. But my research with all the blue chip ratio stuff, the teams that consistently compete for national titles are the teams that have the most dudes that cause the other staff to go, oh, damn, we don't have a guy that looks like that, right? Look at Ernest Green for Georgia this week, just destroying that Florida player. You know, young kid for UGA coming in, looking special immediately. I agree with you. I think you nailed it. And Clemson is a program. They spend like it. They have expectations of it. I mean, Dabo's making $11.5 million, as Tyler from Spartanburg pointed out. The expectation is to compete for national titles. Also, like, I thought Dabo kind of handled that okay, and it made me wonder, like, was that call a plant? Because how in the heck do you get that call 2 minutes and 15 seconds past a call screener? Like, the producer of that show has got to be sort of in on the bit here. So I wonder if it wasn't a setup, but that's just me.
I don't mind. I have no issue with the way that Dabo responded. I think in a lot of ways, you know, Tyler from Spartanburg, that was him really talking to the entire Clemson fan base, right? That was a good reminder of, hey, this is what we've done. This is what we've accomplished. We're confident in our process. But another question for you. Let's say you are the AD of Clemson, right? You get to have a kumbaya with Dabo Swinney, let's say an exit meeting after the 2023 season. Let's call it 7-5, right? In a bowl bid. What is that conversation that you're having with Dabo Swinney, or what are the maybe 1 or 2 bullet points that you want to make sure you get across to him as he approaches the 2024 season and the offseason ahead?
Sure. So I think you need to say, look, Dabo, a lot of teams out there, basically all teams who are big-time programs, are using the transfer portal not necessarily to raise their ceiling, but to raise their floor, right? If you lose 2 receivers like you did to injury so far this year, we need to make sure that we are using the portal to have enough competitive depth to where we don't have a disaster, to where teams like Duke and other like lower-level ACC schools are able to man us up without repercussions. Also, it's very clear now, and it's been for 2 years, that the offensive staff as a whole, not Garrett Riley, but a lot of the other guys, did not have the qualifications to be on a national championship type staff. We've given you the leeway to see if these guys would work out. They're not working out. They weren't really qualified to have these jobs in the first place. I would like you to go out and hire some guys who are a little bit more experienced at this level. If the guys you hired go elsewhere and they prove to be good coaches over time because they actually had an opportunity to grow and, learn how to be a coach, cool. Bring them back. But this is Clemson. We have real expectations. So I need to see you shedding some of the dead weight on the roster, bringing in some transfer portal guys that at least raise our floor so we can avoid a disaster scenario like we're having right now at receiver. And I need a little more experience and some proven guys on this offensive football staff.
It sounds to me like after this season, Dabo has lost the benefit of the doubt. You only get one season like this, and we'll see how they finish it out, right? I mean, the other thing is you look at Clemson's schedule, Notre Dame coming to town playing good football, Georgia Tech, right, just beat a top 20 team in North Carolina, UNC as well, and then you got at USC, right? So there's no gimmies here for Clemson the rest of the way, and a big one this season. But I can't even remember the last time that they were under 500 at this point in the season. That would be something for our Ryan McGrady to take a look at there. But it seems like, I guess what I'm saying is, it used to be just a Dabo-run program. I think what this does is opens the door to more voices, additional voices to come in and say, hey, we got to take a step back, recalibrate, and really kind of think about how we're going to go about in the future. You brought up, Bud, a lot of good points about what that looks like. Coaching hires comes into that. How do we deal with NIL? How do we deal with the transfer portal, right? So I don't know, Bud. The last thing I'll ask you on Clemson, what is your confidence level on Dabo Swinney to make these type of changes?
I actually think he's going to make them. I think Clemson is sort of too big to fail, or at least too big to not try. Right. So I do think they're going to tell Dabo, hey, you need to make some important changes here. You need to adapt with the sport. We still have a lot of belief in you.
I'm rooting for Dabo, man. I love the way the guy goes about his business. I think he has built it the right way. I think the game has changed rapidly. I think sometimes that catches up on people. We'll see, but it is that time now, this offseason, regardless of how they finish here, that you're going to say, all right, back to the drawing boards. What do we need to do to get back to who we have been over the last decade? All right, Drew, Bud, another team that we will talk about, USC, Lincoln Riley. It's kind of been a up and down season despite the record, 7-2 record, still in the top 25, number 24 in the new college football playoff rankings that came out last night. And Bud, this is one, I think if you read the tea leaves, there's been some murmurs kind of behind the scenes. You check in with some of the sources in college football that Lincoln Riley is, I would say, getting fatigued with the new age of college football. We talked about NIL. We talked about the transfer portal. Just goes to show this is not exclusive to Dabo Swinney. This is a guy that's had a lot of success, and now he's at USC year 2. Massive expectations there as well. And for more context on this, Ryan McGrady, what do you got on USC and Lincoln Riley?
On USC and Lincoln Riley, we got a couple things. They're allowing 32.6 points per game this year, which is 112th in FBS. And the stat that we keep updating every week in the research department, they've allowed 34-plus points in 5 straight games for the first time since they joined the FBS level back in 1922. And then you look at recruiting, they only have 5 commits from the state of California in the class of 2024. It's been a big issue and talking point in Southern California the last couple of weeks. And Lincoln saying we're going to recruit the whole country. It's not going to be just California, but you look at their history since 2010, this is just the second season that they've had less than 50% of their class come from the state of California. And the first one was in 2022 when they only had 9 players coming in that class, and 4 of them were from California. This year they have 5 of their 16 from California, but you go back to some years, they're up over 70% coming from California. Back in 2014, they had 20 players, 77% of their class. 2011, 20 players, 69% of their class. And a couple other years where they're up over 70%. And talking to guys that were on staff under the Pete Carroll era at USC, they would only leave California and Southern California specifically if it was a first-round guy. But right now it looks like they're leaving California for most of their class.
That's pretty interesting. The one thing that we should mention there, Pete Carroll was a long time ago, right? Early 2000s. The game has changed a lot. But with USC, you kind of look at Lincoln Riley, there's 2 things, right? The recruiting that I don't think is talked about as much. I think they're recruiting very well offensively. That is not an issue there. I think the trenches on the defensive side of the line of scrimmage, they've leaned on the transfer portal. I think that's one of those things that they're going to have to take a step back and say, okay, is this the right path forward? We'll get to that the other thing, Alex Grinch and this defense, and Ryan McGrady mentioned it. Since 2019 to 2020, when he was with Lincoln Riley in Oklahoma, 2019 defense for OU, 64th. They make a jump to 29th in 2020. 2021, they regress 30 spots to 59th. And then at USC 2022, they're 94th. 2023, they are currently 112th. So this has been, I would say, a downward trend for Alex Grinch under Lincoln Riley on the defensive side of the ball for the last 3 years. And now you're heading into the Big Ten Conference, where defense is a big part of how you win football games there. But your general feel on the direction of USC under Lincoln Riley, and what I mean by that, we talked about expectations with Clemson. Do you feel that this is a team that is rightfully building to win national championships under Lincoln Riley at USC?
I have mixed feelings on this, right? I'm not going to pretend that I know every single little detail that's going on inside that program. But and I said this on the Cover 3 pod, you can just watch them and anticipate stories coming out later this year, like, hey, this was going on in practice, or this wasn't happening in practice. My numbers actually do see improvement in this year's defense compared to last year's defense, which I know sounds crazy. Last year I had them in the 90s. This year I have them in the 70s if you adjust for opponent and sort of like take the randomness out of turnovers. Last year's defense was just a total like turnover-fueled luck box. This year they're playing a little bit better on a down-to-down basis, and they just don't have the turnovers, which defensive coaches hate this, but the stats show that turnovers for the most part year to year are luck. You can control a lot of stuff. You really can't control turnovers as much as defensive coaches would like to believe that you can. The recruiting piece does matter to me, though, because, yes, it's a smaller world in recruiting now, and guys go all over the country. Guys leave the West Coast to go to the Big Ten or the SEC. I get that. But if you're doing a great job at USC, Brennan Baker is wearing cardinal and gold, right? Breland is staying home, right? Like, does Xavier Brown get out of town? Those are the type of guys you really need to, like, if USC is rolling, they sort of have the right of first refusal to almost all the elite prospects west of the Rockies. With all due respect to Dan Lanning at Oregon, obviously, who's doing a great job and has actually beaten USC on a couple of these guys. So I think there are some reasons for concern, and we have to ask, Caleb Williams is one of the most talented quarterbacks we have ever seen play college football. I think it's going to be fair to ask, like, is USC wasting Caleb Williams' time?
I think that's fair. I mean, the other thing, I want to go back to the recruiting piece real quick. I think USC has 3 players from California that are currently in the top 247. There's 21 players in the state that are ranked inside the top 247, so that's saying something. Also, none of those guys are top 5 ranked players in the country either. You talk about Julian Sain, he's off to Alabama. Now, here's the thing. I'm not going to push back on Lincoln Riley when it comes to quarterback development. He's got the benefit of the doubt there. But Brandon Baker, you brought up, he's going to Texas. Another guy, Aiden Breland, his teammate, he's going to Oregon, right? Dakota Fields, another guy, Jay Serra, going to Oregon. I think Oregon has become a nuisance on the West Coast for Lincoln Riley. Those guys recruit hard. They recruit very similar to the way Kirby Smart recruits at Georgia. But who do you have more confidence in right now? Dan Lanning heading into the Big Ten or Lincoln Riley?
Honestly, it's Dan Lanning for me right now. They seem to really have it together on the field, and they're playing for keeps off the field. Like, the rest of the Big Ten needs to be on notice with what Oregon is doing. Like, they're going to come in, and obviously, like, all the schools in the Big Ten West are going to be behind Oregon roster-wise. I think Oregon's aiming higher. I think if you're in Happy Valley, you got to be like, okay, that's great. I mean, Oregon is really, really playing the game for keeps and ramping up that roster. So they're aiming for the very top of the Big Ten. I don't know if we can exactly say the same with USC right now with the level they're recruiting.
I think that is going to be one of the more interesting storylines to kind of follow next year, how USC kind of acclimates into the Big Ten Conference, a conference that is known for a very different style of football, right? It's like taking an NFC West team and matching them up with an AFC North team. 2 completely different styles of how they play. So USC, going to be interesting to watch under Lincoln Riley. But I think the last thing there is, like, you know, we're going to talk about this in a second. Just, you know, it's pure speculation, but you kind of hear some of the things about Lincoln Riley. You hear the NFL coaching stuff. Would I be surprised? Yes. Would I be shocked? No. He seems like a guy that just kind of is like, you know what? I'm over it. I don't know if I want to do this anymore, right? And the defensive thing seems like such an investment. And it seems like it's been neglected over the last 3 years. That's the thing that makes me really hesitant about USC, is that this has been a problem that I think should have been fixed 2 years ago. And here we are 2 years into it at USC from the last year at Oklahoma that said, hold on, we got some things that we need to reevaluate. He's gone forward with Alex Grinch. He seems to have a lot of confidence in him. And you look at USC defensively, it's not like the cupboards, like they have some talent, right? They have some pass rushers. They got some guys on the back end. They got some young guys playing well at the second level. They have Mason Cobb, Tackett Curtis. They have some pieces there, and I know you said that they were improved, but I would say the lack of defensive development is the biggest thing that makes me hesitant about USC going forward. And I know we've kind of beat that drum, but if you want to know the difference, really at the end of the day, it's the emphasis that Dan Lanning is putting at the point of attack on both sides of the ball that I don't see emulated at USC, and I don't think that is something that you can just overlook when this is a team going to the Big Ten.
Totally agree. I think the line of scrimmage and the overall toughness of the program are worth talking about for sure, because we got about a 2-year sample now, and they don't play with good physical toughness. Doesn't appear.